Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody around different parts of the world. This is another Sunday culture storytelling where we share stories of food, travel, history, and inspiring people stories, or sometimes infamous people stories. Today, it's a pleasure to invite Terry. I am going to spotlight Terry now so everybody can see everybody. Um, to who is a London-based historian, especially specialized in Tudor period. Terry, a few quick back and forth conversation with you. You're based in London and you specialize in Tudor period history of British English history. So in your view, what's so special about this period in English history?
Yes, I work 1 or 2 days a week in a college with 18, 19 and 20-year-olds. Um, and as you say, Minji, I work with the Tudors, well, not work with the Tudors, talk about the Tudors mostly, and also the Stuarts, which are the family that come after them. So it's a period of between 400 and 600 years ago. In terms of what's so special actually about them, on I suppose the main thing is probably rather superficial. It's in terms of human interest, these are all very much larger than life characters. So it's better than any soap opera that is currently on television in terms of all the skullduggery and bad things that they actually get up to. It's absolutely incredible. And in terms of the Tudor and Stuart families, these are horrible, horrible families in terms of the way they treat each other. But beyond the sort of like the human interest and the soap opera aspect of it, I think what's really interesting is that if you look at when the period starts in 1485, when Henry VII, the first Tudor, came to the throne, and go right up to Queen Anne, 200, 300 years later, 1714, when she finished her reign. What you have during that time is the making of modern Britain. And Britain, at the beginning of the period, if you and I were to be transported back, is very alien. You probably wouldn't recognise a lot of it. By the death of Queen Anne at the end of the period, the last Stuart, you would recognise quite a fair bit. So it's about the creation of modern British culture and modern British identity.
Indeed. So this Tudor period from 1485 to 1603, according to some historian, England was economically healthy, more expensive, and more optimistic compared even to Roman times. So is that why you became particularly interested in being a historian, particularly for that period? What got you interested in it?
I've always found it interesting. I think, as I say, it is a very much about the human interest. Certainly for other friends who are also on the broadcast now and actually in the UK. When I was a little boy, I got very entranced by thing called Ladybird books, which are like picture books with sort of beginner readers. I don't know how widely these books are available. Were these books available in your part of the world? Ladybird books, Minji?
So I came to know about Ladybird books when I came to Britain. I absolutely love them. They're fantastic for children. About everything. For the audience, I will let the audience answer you by typing in their chat box if you type in your location. And if you have read a Ladybird book, if you have heard of it or not, feel free.
Could I also ask them, Minji, whilst they're doing that, the music that we played at the beginning, Greensleeves, we don't know 100% who wrote it, but has anyone got any idea who might have wrote it? Could I also ask people to actually do that as well, who might have wrote that music, 500 odd years ago?
That's
See if everyone knows.
a good question. So Henry VIII.
Yes, completely. And for those who don't know who Henry VIII was, which I suspect most of you do know, he's probably the most famous English king, and certainly probably the most famous Tudor king. Yeah.
And I think I saw Mark. He was trying to display a book. Mark, are you trying to see? Oh, I'm gonna spotlight you now. Oh, is that?
A Ladybird book.
So what's that? Can you tell us?
It's a Ladybird book on heraldry.
Great. So,
right. Okay.
and
okay.
so
yeah, sorry, go on.
And then Tajuddin also wrote in the chat box, they have Ladybird books in Malaysia. So go ahead.
Well, I was talking to Gary just before we all actually came on, and he was talking about the fact that he had studied the period before this, from Henry II right up to just before Richard III, Henry VII. I wonder how you would describe the period before. I was the period I'm going to talk about.
Oh.
No?
What was your question? Were you asking me?
I couldn't get my mic to work.
All right, okay. Did you hear what I said?
Yes, I did. And
how would you describe, because you told me just before we went on air that you actually studied a course in the kings and queens of the period before I'm going to talk about, the 12th, 13th, 14th century, 11th century. What would you describe the big themes of the period in Britain then?
My belief is the wildly difference between the top and the bottom of society.
Mm-hmm.
Most people fell into the bottom rung of society, and there wasn't much in the middle. And then the nobility was, of course, prime.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I'd agree with that. I'd agree with that, definitely.
So thank you for a really interactive beginning. So this session is going to be really interactive. Harry is not going to let our attention focus on slides. He will do live talk and ask questions so we can interact in the chat box. So Harry, I'm going to spotlight you completely and let you take over.
Right. Good day to you. As Minji says, I'm going to talk about 200, 300 years in time theme, 1485 to 1714, and two families. Well, they're really the same family, to be honest. The Tudor and the Stuart family ran the country. Why I'm interested in talking about this particular period is because of the fact that at the very beginning, when a king called Henry VII, the first Tudor, took the throne, before then, England, as Gary has actually talked about, was a very violent place, a very brutal place. And also, even though there was generally one king in England, and actually sometimes there was more than one king, there sometimes were 2 or 3 kings competing, it wasn't a very, very unified place. And lots of battles. There was something called overmighty nobles, which basically meant that there were various nobles, often who had a regional power base, who quite often did their own thing and tended to actually ignore what was going on with the king in London. So that was a very different world. By the end of the period, we have a world where, well, for starters, we have the United Kingdom. Because at the beginning of the period of time I'm going to talk about, we had 4 kingdoms: Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and England. By the end of it, we have Britain. So we've gone from 4 kingdoms to 1 kingdom. We've gone from lots of people competing for power to having one ruling family, but also that ruling family is much less important. At the beginning of the period, they are everything. You have the term which historians use, which is called personal monarchy, which is why when you study history at college, if you're studying this period, you spend a lot of time talking about the faults and the virtues of the particular king or queen, because their personality is so important in terms of what happened in the country. By the end of the period, Parliament, it's not like Parliament now when everyone gets a vote, but Parliament certainly was much more important. And by the end of the time, when you're actually looking at this period of time, it's much less about the monarchy and the royal family, and it's much more about prime ministers. It's much more about political parties. So it's the birth of modern Britain. Why is it particularly useful to talk about modern Britain in terms of the world? Well, up until the middle of the 20th century, as I'm sure you know, Britain ruled a quarter of the world, and its culture was very important in terms of determining the world culture, because it was a global superpower. I think that's probably one of Britain's problems in the here and now, in the fact that some people still think we're a global superpower in the way we were 100 years ago. But certainly the British culture of then was very, very important. What I'm going to also do is talk at some length about the River Thames as well, because this is really, really important in terms of London identity, English identity, British identity, British culture. What would be really useful for me to know, I don't know, it's a simple way of actually doing this, if maybe you either want to put no or yes plus. What I'd really like to know is no means you've never been to London, never been to the United Kingdom. Yes means you've maybe been here, but maybe just 1 or 2 short holidays. Yes plus means maybe you live here or you come here a great deal. Just so I can get a sense of my audience's knowledge base. That'd be really, really helpful.
So no is
never been here. Never been here. Yes, he's been here on holiday maybe once or twice, just for a short time. Yes plus would be the fact that you live here or you've been here for many, many months on holiday. So you know it well. You've studied here for a year or you've worked here for a year.
Great. I love
just so I know, what people know and don't know.
So we have a couple of no's, a lot of yes plus, almost like 50% yes plus and 50% yes. And people have lived here, studied here, and stayed here for either a couple of months or a few years, or they have come to visit several times already. Wow, you have a very diverse answer, Terry.
So what would you say percentage-wise in terms of the no, in terms of the yes and the yes plus? I don't expect you to but what would you say, 10%, 80%, 20%? What would you say no is 20%?
No is about, I think, 5 to 10%. Yes is about the 40%, and yes plus 40%, but there's also yes plus plus. I have no idea what does that mean.
I think yes plus probably means people like me who've lived here all their lives. So how many yes plus pluses are there here?
I've got Jeffrey yes plus plus, and oh, we got Mark yes plus minus. Mark. Can you explain what's yes minus plus minus?
Well, I come from Kent, but I moved when I was 2 years old to Scotland. But I come back to London on a regular basis for the Workers' Educational Association because their board meetings tend to be in London. So I'm there quite a lot, but I haven't been for the last year. So that's why it's plus minus, because it's kind of complicated.
Great. Oh, we got Val. Val, you are yes plus plus as well. Do you mind if I spotlight you and invite you to speak? So what made you yes plus plus?
Well, I am British. I live in south of England, and I'm married to a true Cockney. We've been to London rather a lot.
So welcome, Val. Jeffrey, are you ready to introduce yourself? Why you are yes plus plus? Okay. Well, maybe not yet. I'm trying to find Jeffrey. Okay. Yeah, Jeffrey, I'm gonna spotlight you now.
Hi there, it's all right.
You introduce yourself and you are yes plus plus.
Yeah, very simply because my family is half English, quarter Scots, and the other quarter we're not sure about, but it's certainly based in the United Kingdom. So I'm a plus plus. I'm a Freeman and was born in London. Had a fascination with the city, went to school in the city. So maybe I should have put a third plus in there as well. But anyway, that's why I put yes, plus, plus.
Great. Very welcome, Jeffrey. Yes, plus, plus, plus. So, Harry, you carry on.
Wonderful. That's a very diverse audience, which obviously makes it sound a little bit difficult to pitch because of the fact that you're talking to, I'm sure there's some people in the audience who know just as much as I do, and there's other people in the audience who know very little about the UK. So that's obviously a very, very broad range of people. But I'll do my best to interest both wings, from those who are very knowledgeable to those who actually are very new to the subject. First off, talking about the River Thames. The River Thames is crucial. It goes through the capital. It connects with the sea. England has always been a trading nation. It's a maritime nation. London was for many years basically a port, the main port of England, and it's where ships come and go, and been very, very connected. And the heart, as I said, for many years, is a global empire. Now, in terms of how this connects with the royal family, it was particularly important in the time of the Tudors and the Stuarts. You need to remember that the roads then were not very good. They were often quite dangerous, often muddy, and particularly in the winter and the autumn, they often became completely impassable. The Thames did occasionally freeze in the bitterly cold winters of the past, but however, it was a much more reliable highway to get quickly from one place to another than actually using roads. Most of the key big royal palaces were actually on the River Thames, for people who don't know London well, they probably, when they think of Royal Palace, they think of Buckingham Palace, which actually is, a mile or so away from the Thames. And the reason it's that is because the fact that it's the new one, the one that everyone knows around the whole world, was not there in the Tudor and Stuart days. The ones that were there, some of them are no longer gone, are now gone. The most important one was probably the Palace of Westminster, which is where our Parliament is now. In the very centre of London. There was also another one downstream in Greenwich, a couple of miles downstream towards the sea. That is no longer there, but it is a World Heritage Site, and a lot of tourists are very interested in going to Greenwich. And then further upstream, which is still there, is the Queen's, which is probably most of the time, it's probably most of what the place she actually regards probably most as home when she's in England, which is Windsor Castle. And the boat used to go in between these various castles to move them from place to place. Now, that was done for a number of reasons. One is because the fact that these castles needed spring cleaning. When the Queen or King was there with their court, they got very dirty. So after a couple of months, they wanted to move out and just go a couple of miles downstream or upstream to a new house, leaving the whole house to be cleaned by the servants whilst they're away. But even more important than that, royals was all about display. Everything was about being seen. So going from castle to castle was something which was a big deal. Frequently, the King or Queen would sit on a boat on public display on a throne, and in all their glorious robes, and it'd be a chance for the ordinary people to see the King or Queen floating past in between one castle or another. It was very important then for the King or Queen to be seen, and very important they look particularly magnificent and rich. Even if the public finances were being pretty ropey, it was very important that they put on a good show. So they had to look grand. The reason being, as I talked to you about how at the beginning of the period, England was very unstable. There were lots of competing warlords looking to actually be the main man. The way that you established that you were the big boss is that you had the most money, you had the most grandeur, you had the most army. So therefore you needed to make sure that when you went by on your boat in between castle and castle, anyone who was thinking of actually doing an uprising or thinking that I'd like to be king would look at your magnificence and go, it's not worth it, I'm going to die if I actually try and attempt to have a battle with this individual. They had something then which was called the Great Chain of Being. What that meant is that God had decided what role you had in life. You're either at the top of the pile, a king, which meant you were practically God's representative on earth, or you were a noble, which was the next level down, or you were someone in the middle classes, next level down, or you were a peasant, which is the next level down, or you were an animal. God had decided your role in life, and it was up to you to agree to do what your social betters told you to do. If you challenged your social betters, you were going against God. Now, obviously, the king might make a bad decision, but because he was human, but God would punish him, not you. It was not your role to actually punish the king if he made a bad decision. That was up to God. Very convenient, very, very convenient. So in an extreme circumstance, if you were not guilty of something and the king decided you were going to die, wasn't yours to question. It was up to God in the next life. Not so very, very convenient. It was also meant to be a two-way relationship in the fact that God was the father, and he looked after everybody, and his representative was the king or the queen. It usually was the king, because of the fact that it was seen as a bit of a curse having a queen, because it was like God was angry with you. Having a woman actually being in charge was regarded very sexist in those days. God was angry with you, is that you had ended up with a queen. But their role was like a parent figure. They were your parent. The king was your parent, and quite literally, in terms of the lower orders, they were the children of the king or queen. And it was important for the parent or king to show love to their children, but also it's important to chastise. If the children were naughty, and this kind of language was used about ordinary people, if they were naughty, it was a parent's job, i.e. the king or queen's job, to punish them. Now, that produced lots and lots of discontent, and Minji quite rightly asked me at the very beginning why I'm so interested in this period, because the fact that over this period, as I said at the beginning, it went from one person making nearly most of the decisions, and by the end of it, we had a parliament and lots of people making decisions. So how do you move from this situation where God's representative on earth and you mustn't question him, to the end when you actually get a parliament? Now, I could talk for hours about this, and I have talked for hours about it in other situations, but just in terms of shorthand, probably the best description of it is lots of murders. That's how you get from one thing to another. In the beginning of the period, the king or queen was very crafty. I mentioned that there was a problem of overmighty nobles who were constantly challenging the king for rulership. What the king tried to insist is that you had to be in London. And you had to basically be at the king's court if you wanted to have influence. So what he actually played was the game of divide and rule, where all the king's nobles were fighting for the king's attention, because if they were doing that to actually get noticed by the king, they weren't in a position to actually challenge. So that's what the early period is a lot about. Who was the king's favourite, who wasn't the king's favourite, who was in, who was out. As the time went on, Parliament became more and more rebellious. Certainly one of the Tudor queens, Elizabeth, referred to the Parliament as rebellious children, naughty children, to use that kind of language when she actually was talking to them, because they weren't doing what she wanted. And the situation got so bad when, as I said, the Tudors and the Stuarts then by then in control. And as I say, they are basically the same family. It's a big extended family. By the time the Stuarts were in control, relationships started to really break down between Parliament and the Crown. You had a situation where a very famous king called Charles I ended up, because he felt that he was God's representative on earth and that Parliament ought to do what he said. Parliament was refusing, civil war broke out, and the end result was actually that Charles I actually lost his head. He had his head cut off. And for the only time in British history, for 11 years, Britain was a republic. It was run by Parliament, so we had no royal family. However, there was a royal family shaped hole in the British life. Britain has always really liked heritage and tradition. So at the end of this period of 11 years, it was a quite short period, the royal family came back. But when the royal family came back, they had less power. They had to agree in order to come back that Parliament would have a stronger role. It didn't happen straight away because the first one or two kings after they returned actually were quite autocratic. By autocratic, I mean wanting to make most of the decisions. But as time went on, and there was something called the Glorious Revolution, which happened in 1688, which was a huge big shift in terms of sort of the king of the day actually losing their power. Parliament increasingly became into the ascendant. The main reason why that actually happened was the king of the time, who was a gentleman called William, was actually more interested in Europe, and he actually ended up becoming King of England almost by default because of the fact that he was more interested in fighting wars in France. He had a mortal enemy in terms of the French king, who was called Louis. He was more interested in fighting him. So he took his eye off the ball, and Parliament increasingly made more and more decisions. So by the end of the period, one of his daughters, who was Queen Anne, had much more of a ceremonial role. By that I mean that she was there just as a figurehead. Parliament increasingly was more and more important. As you know now, we have Queen Elizabeth II, who is directly related to all of these people I'm talking about. Her role is mostly ceremony. She is head of state, she is head of the church, but the power rests with Parliament. And how that came to be is very much about these 200, 300 years that I'm talking about when things went from Tudor to Stuart. And just finally, before I actually put it over to you and actually make it more interactive, rather than me talking at you, because the fact I think it's nothing duller than someone just talking at you all the time. I think all the research on teaching actually shows that you have people's attention for about 15, 20 minutes, and then after that their attention just drifts off elsewhere and they stop listening, which makes sort of our lectures a bit problematical, to be honest. Before I actually do that, if you went back in time to the end of the period we're actually talking about, and you went to the court of Queen Anne, or the court of the king who came immediately afterwards, King George I, you would recognise so much in terms of things you see on television, in terms of the crown, the way the court actually interacts with the king or queen, in terms of what is regarded as British qualities. Britain has ways of actually perceiving itself in terms of its national character. Whether it's self-deluded or not, it perceives itself as being democratic, about fairness, about respect for tradition, respect for law and order, not wanting chaos, and also about wanting to have gradual change, not have revolutions in the way that other countries have big revolutions, like, you get the communist revolution in Russia or China or whatever, and suddenly everything changes, while in Britain everything is done much more slowly. It's no accident that the party that governs us at the moment, the Conservative Party, has been in power for the majority of the last 100, 200 years. The essence of conservatism is great respect for the past and only changing when things are strictly necessary, and doing it in quite a slow incremental way. And for whatever reason, whether you like the Conservative Party or not, whether you like Boris Johnson or not, that seems to go down well with the British people, because they generally tend to re-elect Conservative governments for good or ill. As I said at the very beginning, we were four kingdoms at the very, very beginning of the period I'm talking about. the last queen I was talking about, Queen Anne, before 1714, was responsible for making sure everyone, all the countries were united. And I know that I've got one or two Scottish friends actually on the lost and waves, so they might actually bitterly regret, or they might not. I don't know, because that's obviously a big issue at the moment about whether, if Scotland wants to sort of rip up what actually happened a couple of hundred years ago. People obviously have big views about that. What I want to do for the remaining half hour is, rather than me running my mouth all the time, what I'd like you to actually do, and I've actually given you some help actually, because I've mentioned a few names. I did mention that it was all about personal monarchy, so the character of the king or queen, the ruler, is really, really important, because their foibles, their good things, bad points, determined what happened in terms of British life and British culture. What I'd like people to do is, if they can jot down the name of any king or queen that they can remember from this period, and what that king or queen is most famous for having done, particularly as regards creating modern 21st century Britain. So I'll rephrase that, because that's quite a lot of information I was throwing at you. What I'd like you to do is to jot down the name of any Tudor or Stuart king or queen from this period of time, from 400 to 600 years ago, what they are most famous for having done in their reign, particularly with regards to a lasting legacy. So not something which they did and then 20, 30 years later just stopped, something which they did, which have created 21st Britain. And obviously the ones who are on yes, these are things that they will face every day in their daily life as they wander around London or Glasgow or Edinburgh or whatever, or Dublin or Cardiff, so I include the other kingdoms, or countryside area of these places. And for the friends actually from other parts of the world, things that they recognise when they watch television and Britain is actually mentioned. So that's obviously for the nose. People who just see Britain occasionally on the TV screen. It may be that you don't actually see Britain on TV screens much at all, because we obviously think we're the centre of the world, but we might not well be as far as you're concerned. Okay, so yeah, if you could sort of like jot some things down, and then maybe Minji can read out some of the comments, and I can comment on your comment. Yeah, so I'll give you time to write some stuff down.
Sure, we got the name of Henry VIII coming up a lot, of course. Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries, James IV of Scotland, who took over the kingship of England.
James VI.
James VI. Henry VIII's separation of English church from the authority. Henry VIII break from Catholicism. James I brought in Scotland. Mary, Queen of the Scots, who was murdered by Queen Elizabeth of England. And Lillian has a comment. Who's the who got beheaded? James II. A lot of queens and king's name coming up.
Okay, I'll comment on a few of those and then I'll go back to you, because you've obviously gone for the most famous ones, and it'd be nice to talk about some of the ones who are less famous and actually just as influential, but I'll deal with the most famous ones first. Henry VIII, the main thing was coming up there was dissolution of the monasteries and the creation of the Church of England. People are absolutely right. That is absolutely key in English life, because of the fact that Henry created his own church, mostly from the point of view of the fact that he wanted to marry a younger woman to give him a son. And in terms of that younger woman, the Pope, the Catholic Church, wouldn't give him a divorce. So he decided, well, his courtiers decided to help him by actually creating his own church. And given the fact that Henry was head of that church, he made the rules. And the Church of England is the official church of England today. And our Queen is the head of the Church of England, and Christianity is very, very important to her. And the Church of England has obviously got branches across the whole world. So it's you know, it's very important in terms of this, the history of religion. I'd also say in terms of modern Britain, many schools in England are Church of England schools. So, for example, when I went to school, a lot of my school life was all about the Church of England and Church of England ceremonies in the morning before you went to your lessons. So, yeah, that's hugely important in English life. James VI of Scotland and the First of England, because it's the same person. He was, you know, and he is the son of Mary Queen of Scots, who was also mentioned by Minji. Mary Queen of Scots was never Queen of England, I have to say. In terms of James I and James VI of Scotland then being the same person, one or two of my Scottish friends might actually on this thing might actually sort of take umbrage with what I'm going to say, but I don't think, given the fact he was the last King of Scotland, I don't think he was actually that interested in Scotland from what I've researched about him. He was basically most interested in having a good life, and Scotland was quite a poor country at the time, and he was delighted to become King of England because the King of England was much richer. So he couldn't actually wait to come down here because he was a bit of a party boy. He loved having fun and loved all the food and the drink and you know, all the big social life. So once he came down to London, he rarely returned to Scotland. I know in Scotland there's a lot of romance about the last Scottish kings, but I don't think that James is actually worthy of you know, regarding as sort of like, oh, isn't it sad that, you know, that was the last King of Scotland. I don't think he was that actually interested in Scotland when Scotland was independent. And also for many years the King of England had claimed to be King of Scotland. Whether he was or not is another matter, but certainly if you look at the times then, you had overlords, and the overlord always claimed to be King of junior kings, and there were, to be fair to Scotland, there were times when the King of Scotland claimed to be King of England. So it was a two-way process. Mary Queen of Scots is probably the one of the most romantic figures in history, and she the big thing about her is her rivalry with the Tudor Queen, Queen Elizabeth, and lots of movies have actually been made about that. It's very romantic, so they never actually met. What I would say actually about that is the fact that Mary Queen of Scots led an incredible life, but actually made lots and lots of poor decisions, to lose a number of husbands and actually to be accused of actually probably murdering some of your husbands, which is what she was accused of, and also getting involved with plots to actually murder the Queen of England, Elizabeth, wasn't a very wise thing. But having said that, most of the people then were involved in plots to murder each other. That was just the way of the world. But it's certainly a very romantic story. And in terms of people losing their head, before I go back to Minji and get more involvement from you, Henry VIII was famous for cutting off the wives' heads. He had 6 of them. 2 of them are actually lost their head. London's opening up at the moment because of lockdown, and one of the big hit musicals in London at the moment is called Six, which is very difficult to get a ticket. It's a musical aimed mostly at young people, and it's a rock concert basically, and the wives in it sing songs like I Didn't Want to Lose My Head. So that's the name of some of the hit songs on it. I Didn't Want to Lose My Head. And Henry VIII and his wives are huge in English culture. Minji, have you got any more obscure? Well, I don't think that they're not less important than the ones you mentioned, but they've not got the profile. Have you got any kings and queens which are not Mary Queen of Scots, not Henry VIII during that period written down?
So actually, Terry, there are a couple of questions from
okay.
audience. Is it okay to spotlight them? And
okay, fine. We do that if you prefer. Yeah.
Interact with you directly. I think first, maybe I will spotlight Mark. Mark, you've got a question about the church, right?
Oh, I don't think that was actually me, but I don't think that was actually me, but the question I know is about how did Henry go about setting up a church? He must have had support from other churchmen to be able to do what he did.
The principal character, which you probably be aware of as you're involved in it was Workers' Educational Association, you said you're involved with, and he's also had lots of TV series made about him, was a gentleman called Thomas Cromwell. There's a wonderful Hilary Mantel book and a TV series about this individual, which if you're interested in all things Tudor, I'd thoroughly recommend. He was mentored by someone called Cardinal Wolsey, and probably Cardinal Wolsey is that he wanted to be Pope, and he didn't do a very good job of satisfying his master's wishes. His master's wishes were that Henry wanted to divorce Anne Boleyn, and he didn't do a very good job of organising it. It was all too slow, not a lot was happening. So Wolsey was got rid of, and his Thomas Cromwell, who worked for Wolsey, ended up getting his job, and he did a very good job in terms of sort of taking money off the local Catholic churches, and providing Henry with money. Because main reason Henry did this is Henry loved spending money, and the church was wealthy. So if you grab all the church's properties, you make lots and lots of money. And I would say, well, actually, just to give you an example of how Henry worked, because Henry was a bit of a monster. People who, one of the big tourist things in London is on the borders of London, is something called Hampton Court. Hampton Court is a wonderful palace, which is tourist central, definitely worth going to. It was owned by Cardinal Wolsey. The reason it was there is because the fact that Cardinal Wolsey built a lavish house for himself. You don't build a house which is nicer and bigger than the king's house. What he did. So what happened is Henry got angry and stole the house off him and had him killed. Don't build a bigger house than your master. Here's the lesson from that. That's that. Basically, the church is all about money. Henry wants money. He's a spendthrift.
Yeah.
It was Catherine of Aragon. It wasn't Anne Boleyn. It was Cromwell failed in terms of Anne Boleyn, but Wolsey failed in terms of Catherine of Aragon. Yeah,
he did. Yeah, you're completely right. Well, he failed in terms of both of them. Yeah.
So I think I'm gonna spotlight Mike, because Mike, you got some questions. Sorry, I think it's your question about River Thames. Like assassination.
Well, so my question was the one that Mark has just asked. I think we're playing a question tag. So I will ask another one then. Let's see something else. I mean, my one was about how could a king create a church? And I still don't quite understand. I mean, you said that Thomas Cromwell helped him, but presumably the Catholic priests and Catholic leaders had to decide which side they were on. Were they on the side of Henry VIII, in which case they may get support, or were they on the side of the Pope, in which case at best they would probably lose their church, and at worst they'd get beheaded?
I do realise actually, I did the classic mistake actually with the last one. When I was saying about Wolsey and not doing a very good job in terms of sort of divorce, I was talking about Catherine of Aragon. So thank you for correcting me on that. And the next one is number 2 is Anne Boleyn. It's very easy to get all these women muddled up. So thank you for correcting me on that last person. In terms of religion, then religion and politics were very much the same thing. They were completely intertwined. And if you were ambitious, you made sure that you copied the religion of your social betters. There were a few people who were genuine about their faith. That wasn't a great idea. The 2 key people who tried to actually fight against moving from a Catholic society to a Church of England society one was Thomas More, who was a great writer and thinker, and the other was John Fisher, who was a bishop. And as a result of their sincerity about their religion, both of them had lost their head. Famously, with regards to John Fisher, and if you go to the main Catholic church in London, you'll see the tombs of these two people, because they are now regarded as martyrs to the faith. Famously, the Pope, to annoy Henry, made John Fisher a cardinal to show that he was liking what he was doing in terms of supporting the faith. What Henry said, because in order to be a cardinal, you have to go over to Rome to get a red hat. What he actually said was, I can't let John Fisher go over to Rome, but I can send you his head. That shows Henry's actual attitude to it. Most people were quite political. And in terms of the way religion actually worked, one of the main churches in London is Westminster Abbey in the centre of London, where all the big things happen. It's where Boris Johnson, Boris Johnson didn't get married there, but it's where Diana's funeral was and things like that. It's where Prince William actually got married to Kate Middleton. It's where a lot of the big things actually happen in London. Famously, what actually happened with that particular church, after Henry actually died, his children actually became king and queens, and the religion of that church swapped. So for a couple of years it was Protestant, then it would become Catholic, and it would just swap about according to whoever the king or queen was. So you can look at quite a few people actually of that period, and you will see that their religion changes according to who the king or queen is. So people are quite flexible about religious identity.
That's very pragmatic. So I believe audience Carol and Melanie also got a couple of questions for you.
Yeah.
So I'm going to spotlight them. Oh, okay. Right. Carol, if you want to interact with Terry.
Yep.
Yeah, you had mentioned the church where the main Catholic church in London where the tombs are. I was just wondering what church is that?
I'm finding it difficult to hear you. Sorry, it's a bit sort of echoey.
Oh. You had mentioned the main Catholic church in London where the tombs are.
The main Catholic, or the main Church of England Protestant church, and it's not the most senior church in the country, which is actually in Canterbury. But the main one I've been talking about, where most of the kings and queens are buried, and is the biggest tourist attraction, is Westminster Abbey, and that's right next to Parliament. Westminster Cathedral, which is about half a mile away, is the main Catholic church of the whole of the United Kingdom, and that's where our Prime Minister Boris Johnson actually was married in secret yesterday. I found that very interesting because the Catholic Church doesn't do remarriages of people who have actually been married before, but he has been married. This is his third marriage. But when I was thinking, why on earth did they let that happen? Because the Catholic Church is adamant that you can't get remarried, and marriage is forever. But I worked out when I heard on the radio this morning, it's because of the fact that they don't recognise marriages by any other institution. So Boris Johnson was actually married in terms of the Anglican Church beforehand, and his new wife number 3, is a Catholic. So therefore he's able to have his third marriage in the Catholic Church. And obviously, as that church is in the area which is near 10 Downing Street, which is his official residence, he is in the area where he's able to go to that church. We call it being a parishioner.
This is very interesting, Terry, because I'm gonna also spotlight Melanie. Melanie, I hope you are spotlighted. I believe you have questions for Terry.
Hello. Hello.
Hi. I think the observation you shared is so interesting. I was just asking Minju in the chat that we're in lockdown now, so we've been watching a lot of British period dramas. And you mentioned that the TV series that you see on TV nowadays, they probably accurately reflect what's going on in the court, what the British monarchy court is like. So we just finished watching Bridgerton. We're
All right.
wondering
All
whether
right.
they actually reflect accurately what happened during the time.
I haven't watched Bridgerton. I'd love
Oh, you
to.
haven't? Okay, then.
But no, I know about it. I know about it, so I can comment. I'm sure it's wonderful drama, and I'd love to watch it. But from what I gather, and this is totally fair enough, it takes lots of creative. It's more interesting in entertaining than actually describing it as it was. Put it like that. Yeah. I did mention earlier on, if you're interested in the Tudors, the TV series with regards to Thomas Cromwell and Hilary Mantel. As much as a TV series can actually be accurate, and obviously even that has inaccuracies in it, that's probably the closest. It's a BBC drama.
Thank you, Terry.
Great. So Terry, I'm gonna put you back on the spotlight. Anybody else has a question? This is
apart from Henry and James. We've talked about Henry. We've talked about James I and VI. We've talked about Mary Queen of Scots. We've also briefly touched on the first wife, Catherine of Aragon, who Henry should have stuck with, by the way, because she was very, very capable regional deputy for him. And actually she managed to stop Scotland actually invading England. So she was very capable. And we've talked about the second wife, Anne Boleyn, who was way too intelligent for him. Famously, when she actually died and when he had her killed, he said that she meddled too much because Henry preferred women who were much more passive, just did what they said. The love of his life was wife number 3, Jane Seymour, and that's mostly because she didn't sort of question him and just did exactly what she said, and also provided him with a son who eventually became king. But apart from those famous characters, in the last 7, 8 minutes, 10 minutes or so of this, can anybody think of any other king or queen of this period? And again, if you could put down what they're most famous for, which has affected the 21st century.
So Eva from United States would like to know a little bit more. Can you ask if you can talk briefly about Queen Anne?
Right, okay. Queen Anne, she's probably most famous for the uniting of Scotland with England in terms of how she actually affects the 21st century. There's varying views about her as regards every historian has different views about her. The consensus about her is that because she was a very uneducated woman, she didn't expect to be queen. She wasn't best fit to actually make a lot of decisions about Parliament and about the direction of the country. Some historians dispute that, so there's some people who think she was more capable than we let on. In terms of Hollywood and the movies, she's most famous for a film which came out a couple of years ago called The Favourite, which is basically a lesbian love triangle, because she had 14 children, all of whom died, and she had 2 women who she had very, very strong emotional relationships with. The Hollywood film suggested that tipped over into a physical relationship. Whether it did or not is another matter. But in terms of the general public, that's probably what she's most famous for.
Fantastic. Terry, you know so much about all the scandals and gossips of our family. You also have a Eventbrite experience, the royal family scandals.
Yeah, I have an Eventbrite experience, which I'd be lovely to see you on, where I talk in more detail about Queen Anne. And also a rather crazy king called George IV, who is probably the worst king England's ever had, but he's outside the period of time that we're talking about today. In terms of some of the other names that actually people might have wanted to put, who actually are crucial in terms of the way England is in the 21st century, I would mention Charles I and Charles II. Charles I is just before England became a republic, and Charles II, the Merry Monarch, is after England was a republic. Just very briefly, what they're most is Charles I is very famous for his death. He was not a terribly good king, but his death was wonderful propaganda because he died in a way which made people think of Jesus. And when he died, famously, there was a huge groan which came up from the crowd, and people rushed to actually put their handkerchief in his blood, and it became a holy relic. So his death was actually, because he wasn't a terribly good king, he was very arrogant. His death was probably the best thing he did because it provided lots of propaganda for the return of the royal family. And even to this day, actually, you can, if you're a very, very right-wing individual, there is a mass which is held every year in central London in honour of Charles I's soul, and actually talks about and celebrates his life. Interestingly, I occasionally have some very, very right-wing pupils, and they really rate Charles I, and they hate the Republicans who were responsible for his death. So I have some interesting discussions actually with them, because they tend to get into what I'd call fake news when they fabricate history. His son came back in 1660, the Merry Monarch. He was very much a party boy to end all party boys. He had 17 mistresses, and famously, half of the current British aristocracy are his children. So half the people who run our country are directly related to Charles II. Most famously, one of our more recent prime ministers, David Cameron, is direct line related to Charles II. Princess Diana, when she married into the royal family, is directly related to Charles II. He had love children everywhere. And I just finish off by actually telling you a very brief story before I go about one of his mistresses. He had a mistress called Nell Gwynn, who was quite a lower class woman. She was an actress, and she was famous for being very, very witty and quite cheeky. And the king had lots and lots of mistresses. And what happened, this is supposed to be a true story, at the time, people were very religious. You were either Catholic or you're Protestant. And he had, Charles II was an equal opportunities lover. He was quite happy to have women who were Catholics as his lover, quite happy to have women who were Protestants as his lover. He didn't mind. He wasn't at all discriminatory. What happened is a mob gathered round the carriage of Nell Gwynn, and they actually started to show rotten fruit at it and scream at her, "Leave the king alone! Stay away from the king, you Catholic whore, you Catholic prostitute." Famously, she opened the carriage door and shouted out, "Get it right! I'm not that one. I'm the Protestant prostitute."
Yeah, so it was great for her to stand up for herself.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm the Protestant prostitute. Yeah. So that's the wonderful thing about English history, particularly this period. That is one of thousands of very, very salacious, gossipy stories. English history is full of it.
Great. Thank you so much, Tara. This is both so informative and so educational and so entertaining. That's fascinating. We loved it. We have people from Malaysia, from the US, from the UK, Singapore, all over the world who really benefited from your very fun teaching of British history, English history today. So if you would like to know more about how half of Britain was descended from one king, feel free to go to Terry's Eventbrite event. I put the link in the chat box to have more interaction from him, to listen to more royal family scandals and gossip from Terry in the future. Next week, we have a speaker who's going to talk to us about the country of Georgia. Georgia is a country at the intersection of Europe and Asia. It is a former Soviet republic. So this country of Georgia experience, our speaker, Lee Carr, is going to tell us the tales, sights, and traditions, especially the wine stories from the country of Georgia. So come back Sunday the same time. For people who like what you do, if you want to share your travel, your lifestyle, or you recommend a great place you have visited physically or virtually, feel free to share in our Facebook group. The Facebook group is in our email. And if you would like to see some behind the scenes photos of our event, feel free to follow us on our Instagram. So again, thank you so much, Terry. Perfect timing. We learned tremendously about the Tudor period, and we had so many laughs. So everybody,
I've enjoyed it, and it's lovely and sunny. It's a one sunny day in London, so I'm going to get out and enjoy it now.
Oh wow! And this is thank you from Japan, Tarumi. Thank you from China, Scotland. What a wonderful group! So thank you, everyone. See you next week.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.